Hello, and welcome to our webinar covering immigration in 2025 expert insights and reporting advice. I'm Carmen Noble, Program Director and Editor-in-Chief of the Journalist Resource at Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center. Before introducing the panelists, I'll go over a couple of logistical things. One, if you have any questions for the panelists, please submit them in the Q&A box rather than in the chat. And you're also encouraged to chat with each other, but please keep the chat civil and on topic. And next, I will quickly introduce the panelists. Caitlin Dickerson is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and feature writer for The Atlantic who specializes in immigration coverage. She is currently writing a book about the impact of deportation on American society. Austin Coker is an assistant professor at Syracuse University whose research focuses on immigration and border enforcement across the US. He specializes in demystifying complex data, and we're looking forward to having him do that for us today. And finally, Linda Dakin-Grimm is an attorney who has represented more than 100 unaccompanied migrant children and separated families in the US immigration system. She successfully challenged the first Trump administration in federal courts, and she is the author of Dignity and Justice, Welcoming the Stranger at Our Border. And we're going to start with Caitlin. Caitlin, over to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here, and I'm going to dive right in because our time is limited and we have a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to talk about a few things to avoid when it comes to immigration reporting and some best practices that I think will help improve your work. Happy to answer questions about any of these things. But the two problems that I'll focus on to begin with are ones that I've become kind of focused on in the last few years, and I'll just label them sensationalism and a lack of context. So I'll spend a few minutes on those now and share my very rudimentary slides with you. So here are some headlines from the last couple of years that I've pulled. You can see that they come from outlets left, right, and center. There's also a photo that was published by the Border Patrol. And the message that I get from all of these examples is that the country is in an unprecedented emergency that we've never come up against before, and that could surely only lead to disaster. I think one could reasonably reach the same conclusion looking at this data for Title VIII entries to the United States under the Biden administration alone. Those numbers are rising really rapidly. If you attach percentages to them, they seem very scary. And there was a lot of immigration under the Biden administration. But what I try to encourage people to do is to zoom out and take a longer view. So if we just look at this graph going back to 1960, you can see that large numbers of immigration are not new. They're something that we've encountered before, that the world hasn't ended when that's happened. And so when you're writing, I want to encourage you not to just look at the last 2 or 5 years of data, but look at the last 30 or 50 years of data. Again, you're still reporting on the fact that a record has been broken. You're still reporting on the fact that we're in a moment where lots of people are entering the United States, but you're not reporting on a moment that we've never been in before. And I don't have to tell anybody on this call that this issue sort of couldn't be more divisive. And so I think it's really incumbent on us as journalists to turn down the volume when it comes to writing in ways that take a more narrow, short-term view and that scare a lot of people kind of in both directions. Here's another slide that tells a similar story. I just highlighted the years in which apprehensions by the Border Patrol have exceeded 1 million. And I went ahead and underlined the years when a Republican was president and when a Democrat was president. Obviously, the politics of immigration have swapped at various points throughout American history. There have been times when Republicans have been more pro-immigration than Democrats. So I didn't point those numbers out to keep score, but just to again emphasize that, if you're just diving into covering this issue for the first time and you're looking at tweets that people who are in office or are running for office are tweeting, or you're just looking at, the DHS Twitter account, you can see these big, scary numbers, and I think inadvertently play into some misinformation that is not what we're here to do, right? We're here to help people understand the facts in context. Again, large amounts of immigration presents challenges for the United States. And the Biden administration did break a record when it came to border crossing. There's no reason to take away from that. But at the same time, the record that was broken was held by the previous administration, was held by the Trump administration. So a lot of times we're talking about longer term trends that can be presented as short term kind of partisan politics. And we want to make sure that we're not playing into those kinds of views. Similarly, this is my very basic slide that says due diligence. Just a reminder to think about the language that we're using. So I just want to give you an example from early on in my time covering immigration. I remember during the 2012 general election cycle, when President Obama was running for re-election, he talked about how people who wanted to come to the United States to work in low-wage jobs just needed to get in line and do it the right way. And, obviously we print those statements, but journalists rightly pointed out that there was no line for most people from poor countries who were hoping to come and do low-wage work and who didn't have an immediate relative who could petition for them to get in. And so it's just that context that we have to remember to include in every story. The more recent example that I'm seeing is during this campaign cycle, people who came into the United States under the Biden administration's parole programs or who had TPS started being referred to as illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, what have you. Obviously, that was something that President Trump said a lot, but so did many other people and many other journalists. And every newsroom is going to have to make a decision for itself, and there's some style involved here. So have those conversations with your bosses, but pay attention to moments when, again, Republicans and Democrats, it doesn't matter who they are, politicians spin, the language starts to slide, and we want to make sure that we're not misleading people in our stories. To me, undocumented or someone who's in the United States illegally, that means somebody who doesn't have any permission to be in the United States, who isn't known to the government. And that's a big difference. It shows up actually again and again in polling. If you look at how Americans feel about immigrants, whether or not someone came the right way is really important. So, when you just repeat that, this massive expansion of unauthorized immigrants, undocumented immigrants, again, another kind of important language debate there, but whichever term you're using, when you all of a sudden start to describe those people as being here illegally or without authorization, that's influencing people's views, and it's really fanning the flames of sort of fear and fervor on both sides. And so we do have to push back. I know people are really annoyed with journalists right now. It's kind of fallen out of fashion to say, that's not accurate, that's not accurate. It doesn't have to be about a story that just fact checks. It doesn't even have to necessarily be presented as a fact check. But I think when you're writing about and when you're repeating this language in your stories, follow it up with the context that explains what is actually happening so that we're leaving people informed. We can't trust elected officials and people running up for office and even interest groups, obviously, on all sides to use language that is going to be most reflective of the truth. Staying on theme here, I just wrote down some words to avoid. This is Journalism 101. I should not have to put this in a slide and mention it at all, but it's become a problem. We're seeing in stories things referred to as unprecedented that are not unprecedented. We're seeing things referred to in stories that are, most in modern history or least in American history, and it's just not the case. As I mentioned, I've been covering this issue for quite a while. There's very little that surprises me because so many of these trends when it comes to migration and our reactions to it, our enforcement strategies, these things have been tried again and again in administrations, Republican and Democrat, and there's very little that is new. And, I think there's kind of been a vicious cycle here where language continues to sort of amp up more and more, and it's starting to influence journalists, and it's even starting to influence some of the think tanks, not all of them, but some. We're not doing anybody a service if we're misleading them into thinking that we're in an unprecedented situation, whether it's good or bad. So I think and another thing that's relevant here is that copy editors used to be the ones who would go through scripts or go through articles and cut these words out, right? And remind us that we're probably going to get a correction if we use them. And newsrooms have really changed. We don't all have that kind of support. We don't all have multiple editors looking at our stories. So just do it yourself. When you've written a piece, go through it, cut out any language that you're not 100% sure is accurate. It's okay to acknowledge when a record has been broken, but to call something unprecedented, to say it's the first time in modern history or the most in modern history, is a really big leap for you to make. And so you really need to do the deep research required to make sure that's true, or skip it and just stick to what you actually know. Um, Now I'm going to turn to kind of siloing of immigration coverage, because there's great immigration coverage happening at so many outlets, but it's often relegated to one desk. Business reporters are doing great stories about the impact that immigration has on the economy. Education reporters are doing the same. People who cover the courts and the criminal justice system are doing the same. And then people who cover politics very often focus on the raw numbers and then the sort of strong, harsh rhetoric on either side. I think stories are so much better when you can bring all of that knowledge together in one place. So, if you're going to write a story about record-breaking border crossings, help people understand what that means. There was a moment last year when every major outlet reported on the fact that economists had started to reach this conclusion that one of the principal reasons that the United States recovered economically better than any other country in the world was because of massive immigration at the end of the Biden administration. There were lots of stories about that, but it was never mentioned in articles, or rarely. Here I just use the language that I'm discouraging people from using. It was often not included in stories that talked about record-breaking border crossings. And, again, it's not about minimizing in any way what impact immigration has to the United States. It's about being accurate. And, there are many other examples that I could give, and I basically here have just listed desks in a newsroom, so nothing novel there. But I just want to encourage you, when you're looking at one slice of the immigration system, and in particular when you're looking at numbers and you're trying to take a snapshot of a moment in time and help people understand where we are as a country, pull in what others are saying. Reach out to academics. I rely on academics all the time to help flesh out my knowledge of an issue that I'm covering. Even if it's just a quick story and you only have a few days on it, do a quick Google Scholar search. I guarantee you there's probably somebody who's researched the exact part of this story that you're writing about, and get them on the phone. They're going to be able to help you add the nuance that I think so many stories really need right now, just to kind of turn down the heat and rely on. I've listed here Migration Policy Institute, the Center for Migration Studies, and the Congressional Research Service, places that are doing really straight ahead analysis of the moment that we're in. Of course, the think tanks that lean a little bit more in one way or another, they can be helpful too. But I would say first and foremost, try to get to the raw data, and then, of course, people who are doing nonpartisan analysis of it instead of just sort of feverish, quick hit coverage. And to that end, I would say get comfortable with data yourself. That was one of the best things that I did. Really, it was luck that when I started out as a reporter, I started going to IRE conferences and then learned about NICAR, which is a great resource for journalists. I learned how to work in Excel and Access and to write equations. I know Austin is going to talk about sources for data that we should all know about. And I think that as reporters, you're going to have so many more story ideas if you are able to work with the raw data yourself and come to conclusions from it, as opposed to just having to rely on analyses that are done by others. So that's my last slide for you. I want to offer one more tip just based on coverage that I've seen recently. So obviously, there's a lot of focus on domestic ICE arrests that are taking place. And I've seen lots of stories that are based on press releases that have gone out and said, 2 people were arrested from this community, or 10 people were arrested from this community, and 3 of them had US citizen children. And then sort of the stories move on so quickly. And I just want to encourage the journalists who are on the call to go to the families of the people who've been arrested and detained, go to their employers, right? Like that 360 view, go to city officials to understand what impact immigration was having on the region prior to this arrest taking place, and follow the story, go deeper. Don't just stick to the numbers. I think our audiences are really kind of alienated from this story so often because it can be hard to break into. And when there's human detail attached to a numbers story, it can be very, very minimal. So many articles I read just have sort of somebody's first name, the country that they came from, and then maybe a sentence about why they came to the United States. There's so much more work to be done there journalistically, and it's really important to go deeper right now. So just follow and stick around when we're covering these quick changes that are taking place. I remember from the last time that Donald Trump was president, it's the volume, right, of changes that make a moment like this novel, and it can be really easy to write about a change and then move on to the next one. But the best stories, the ones that are going to have impact and that are going to really resonate with readers, are the ones where you stick around for a week or a month or a few months and find out what the real impact of all these changes is going to be. So those are my tips.
Okay. Thank you so much, Killian. That was terrific. And yeah, I'm seeing in the chat, lots of thanks to you. Austin, over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks for having all of us. Carmen, thanks to Journalist Resource. My name is Austin Coker. I'm a professor at Syracuse University, and I've been studying immigration data, I suppose, for about 15 years now, all told. One thing I just want to say out of the gate is, I appreciate all the journalists on the call because, as someone who has had the good fortune of getting some good mentors and having great relationships with journalists over the past several years, I really appreciate and admire the work that you're doing. And I would just be thrilled if we could get more data into reporting. And I think, to Caitlin's point, more contextualization and more fleshing it out. So I want to start with a couple comments, general comments about data. I'd like to show you a couple data sources that you can use. It's not comprehensive, but I want to show you some examples, and then say a couple remarks about long-term strategies for you as a journalist that I think will be very helpful. So just starting off with a couple general comments about immigration data. Most of the data that we have for immigration right now come from federal agencies. And although the government is itself a source of data points that all of us need, it's really important to understand how data is produced. Data has this authority behind it. If you can get a number into your story, it's got credibility and it's shows you what the truth is. And although data is rhetorically powerful, certainly in writing and in public discourse, it's really important for you as a writer and as someone who's working with data and sourcing data to understand that data is always itself produced by someone, by some database, all of which has its own theories about how the world works. It has its own perspectives. It has its own opportunities and limitations. And so in understanding that, it hopefully will clue you into being just very careful about going a level or two deeper to understand how that data was provided. So one of the things I've seen a lot recently is, the agencies will provide a data point to this reporter or that reporter, but not actually publish the data, for the public to see. It's a very interesting strategy. So, I would just say even when the data seems plausible, that the agency may be putting out one at a time, I just want to emphasize that, that data we're not really getting to see the underlying records behind that. And the agencies do have the ability to produce those records for us. And so one thing to think about as a reporter, I think, is to ask, why is the agency that may be telling you one data point, why are they not putting out data for the public to see? One of the reasons the agencies don't release data to the public, even when they could, is that data doesn't always correspond very well to the story that agencies want to tell. And immigration agencies are political agencies. There's no way around it. And it certainly is a divisive issue. So when reporting data, the data that agencies is putting out, it's just really key to understand where that data is coming from, how that data was produced, who's sharing it, and to always try, my suggestion is to always go one step deeper. So whatever the agency gives you, I would always encourage you to try to ask for something a bit more. Whether it's, longer time series of data or more composition of the data. I think one of the best examples I've seen ever is the first week of the Trump administration, ICE was posting data on arrests and detainers. I was highly skeptical that data could be produced as quickly as they were claiming it. And they added a little bit of metadata to clarify what the time even was. They didn't even, they were posting these daily data points and not actually telling you what day it was for, by the way. And a lot of reporters were sort of citing this. I think what I've seen since then is I have seen a lot of reporters get, I think, smarter about being clear that the agency is making a claim to something. And that's another point I would just say when it comes to data is it's very important to understand the difference between data that's pretty well validated and we can trust, and data that's sort of effectively working as a rhetorical argument, which is not data. Data is not really data anymore if you just have a number on a meme. And so I think it's important to embrace a little bit of data skepticism in your work. All of us need to do that as consumers as well. There's a real advantage to getting your hands into the data, by the way, and this is the last sort of principle I'll make, because I noticed some people are asking about, undocumented or illegal, and Caitlin mentioned, undocumented. So let me just say this as clearly as I can to everyone in the room. There is no such thing as an illegal or an undocumented migrant when it comes to government data. There's no field in any data system anywhere that says there are this many illegal immigrants, there are this many undocumented immigrants in the country. Those terms are terms of art. And insofar as numbers have been estimated, even reliably by places like the Pew Hispanic Center from Pew Research, those are still terms of art that are produced by inference, which is why it's so important to understand how data is produced, not because there is a thing called an undocumented or an illegal immigrant. And again, I'm not saying this as a moral point or an ethical point or a political point. I'm just saying it because when you start to get into the data and you go a level deeper than just like pulling out a data point, what you realize is what you'll learn is that the categories that we use rhetorically in common discourse, it forces you to be clear about that. And so, when you start looking at deportation data, for instance, what is a deportation actually? And you can't count things at the granularity of individuals unless you really understand what a deportation is, or what a detention is, or what a bookend to a detention facility is, all of these different categories that we use nonchalantly as if they exist, if you actually look at the data carefully, not just the trends, I'm not talking about statistical analysis, I'm just talking about defining the data points that you're looking at, some of those rhetorical, sensational categories start to fall away. And so what it invites you to do is to ask more precise questions and to make more precise kinds of observations. So what I'd like to do is to share just a couple of data sources with you, just so you have a sense of some of the things that I use for my own work and that you might use for yours. And then I'll close with a couple of strategies for you. So let me go over here. Now, one of the things that's just a really important principle, broadly speaking, for getting into immigration data is understanding where data comes from, back to that issue of production. To do this well, you really have to know your basics about how the government works. So understanding which agency is responsible for which parts of the immigration system is going to be key here. Immigration and Citizenship, USCIS, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, is the agency that primarily handles benefits for migrants. It's the largest in terms of processing of the three main immigration agencies, but the least enforcement oriented. They do have a lot of data on different, on green cards, on affirmative asylum applications that immigrants file, naturalization rates, and they do have refugee processing data as well. So pretty good source. One of the things to note, and this is true for a lot of government agencies, is that there's often a few different types of data that they produce. Some of it is produced regularly, and this is really important for reporters because you probably want to know what the most up-to-date data is. I can't go through in this, in this panel over every single data source and the temporality of how it's produced, but I would just say some data is produced really regularly and reliably, like on a monthly basis. Some is produced sometimes every 2 weeks, some just every quarter, some every year. So when you're looking for data, one thing to just pay attention to is how often is it updated. So the USCIS Data Hub is a really good one. I'm going to actually just skip over to ICE. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, has two main data sources that I rely on that I would encourage people to look at. One is the detention data. The detention data is mandated by Congress. So ICE has to produce this every 2 weeks. And by and large, it's a pretty good data source. It constantly needs validated. So this is a good opportunity to just mention, even if you are using government data, especially government data that's produced fairly quickly, it's really important that you understand how to validate it, which means how to make sure that the data is accurate and reliable. ICE's detention data has errors in it almost every single time they post it. And so it's a decent part of my week usually when they come out with new data to just even check and see if it's legit. ICE also does provide some dashboards. This has become a really dominant trend in immigration agencies where they will pre-clean and produce this data on a monthly or quarterly basis using these Tableau dashboards. It's fine, it's relatively user-friendly. However, unlike some other data sources, this data source forces you into very limited views, and they don't really provide the underlying data here. So I have some issues with it, but it's not bad, and it is a good place to come and look at some recent trends. CBP, Customs and Border Protection, has similar kinds of tools. You see a similar Tableau dashboard where you can also see some of the activity of CBP. These are just a couple government agencies that produce public data on the regular. There are some non-government agencies who also produce data that I think it's important to be aware of. Pew Hispanic, of course, has some really good broad survey data and demographic data. Migration Policy Institute also does a variety of immigration data research. There's, like some government agencies, MPI and Pew Hispanic, instead of producing the same data on a regular basis, they tend to do reports from time to time. And so that's one thing to keep in mind, that there's a difference between data that's produced really regularly and data that's produced thematically as a kind of occasional snapshot. Those are great when they come out and there's a story. But if you're a journalist really trying to dig into data, it's better for you to find those data sources that are produced regularly, because then you can look at it, every time new data comes out, and it helps give you some familiarity. I just want to plug Adam Isaacson's incredible tool here. As I mentioned, a lot of these data sources are locked into Tableau dashboards, which is difficult to get out and to look at for yourself. But there are people like myself and Adam and others who scrape that data and reproduce it in a way that's much more user-friendly. So he's doing great work there. I'm also happy to say that my former intellectual home at Track, their website is back up as well. So there's great data for immigration courts and historical data on immigration enforcement, all of which I think is really valuable. There's more that I could say in terms of data resources and different sources. But let me just finish with a couple of strategies I think are great for reporters. One is, to Caitlin's point, if you can pick a data source that's roughly on your beat and follow it over time, you'll get better. Instead of trying to be an expert at all things immigration data, focus on one or two, and you can really get comfortable with it. Be familiar with which kind of data sets, what data sets are out there and how often they're updated. Let's see. Right. So get your hands into data. I think it's a really valuable thing. I think it can really help flesh out stories. I also just want to say, as one last plug, I think there's opportunities to do a lot more with data than I think are typically being done. Certainly, fact-checking the government is a key component of this. Validating and verifying government claims and trying to stay up with what's actually happening, as opposed to what the government is claiming is happening. But there's actually a lot more that can still be done in terms of tying together first-person narrative and trends in immigration data. And I think, to Caitlin's point, as much as I understand why it's really important for reporters to have the most recent data point that they can possibly get, because your industry is all about timeliness, actually situating with it within a historical data set allows you to get familiar and to say increasingly sophisticated and nuanced things that I think add a lot to journalism, and painting a historical picture. So instead of always looking at what were the deportations this month, can we actually look at the composition of deportations, or the composition, who is getting deported, who's being encountered? There's all kinds of stories hidden in the data that if you just go after a single data point, sometimes you miss. So great to have everyone on the call, and I'll stick around for Q&A. Really excited about this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Austin. We're getting lots of questions in the chat. Will the links to the resources you shared be available? And yes, we will be posting those on journalistresource.org. And now we will turn it over to Linda.
I am here. Hi, everyone. I am missing my share button for some reason. I don't know where that went. I would like to screen share in a minute. And in response to the person who commented that Austin is the reason they're here, Austin and Caitlin are the reason I'm here too. I'm a lawyer, not a journalist. I have a few thoughts that I hope will be helpful to journalists. You see a screen share? Do what? Where am I going? No. It's not, that's not the issue. Sorry. Did I lose it? No, there we are. I'm so sorry. What a way to start. Okay. Well, let me just jump in anyway then without it, unless somebody else can put them up for me. I have some suggestions for reporters, but let me start by giving a little bit of background that I think is helpful to keep in mind. A little quick primer on U.S. immigration law and policies. The first thing for everyone, including your readers, to know is that under our current law, and our current law has been the way it is for quite some time, it is exceptionally difficult for anyone to migrate to live and work long-term in the U.S. as a permanent resident. There are only four roads. The first is family-based migration, which is limited to 226,000 people per year. This is what the Republican folks sometimes call chain migration, although it is exceptionally slow. If you're trying to bring a family member from some countries like the Philippines or Mexico, you can wait decades. The second road is employment-based migration. That's even smaller, and it's limited to 140,000 people a year. This is available to highly skilled workers that have a corporate sponsor. The third road is the diversity lottery, which is 50,000 people per year. And the last road is humanitarian relief, which includes asylum and things like special immigrant juvenile status, trafficking visas, U visas. That's it. So if a person is not admitted to the US as a refugee, which means they have qualified for refugee status from another country while they're in the other country, or does not go under one of those 4 roads, they can fly in on a tourist visa and overstay it, or they can try and cross a border without being detected, or they can walk up to the border and ask for asylum. It's a very tight system. What are not paths to permanent residency? DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. That was an executive action by President Obama in 2012. It was never US law, and it never included a path to long-term residency. It was a trade. I'll give you all my information in exchange for the government agreeing to defer deportation for a short period of time and a work permit. DACA is, the courts have repeatedly ruled that it exceeded the president's authority, and it's virtually over, although it's maybe hanging by a thread. The next is temporary protected status. People have asked about that in the chat and in the Q&A. TPS is what you hear. That is a short-term status offered in the discretion of the US Secretary of Homeland Security for periods of 6 to 18 months due to emergency conditions in home countries that prevented a country's nationals in the US from returning home. It says in its name, it's temporary. It was always meant to be temporary, but people who have TPS perceive it to be a status that entitles them to stay long-term. The Trump administration has already announced ending TPS for Venezuela and Haiti, and their policies entail ending TPS for everyone. Other than that, most of the people in the US working are non-immigrants. So referring to them as immigrants is a language that the government doesn't use. They're here on non-immigrant short-term work permits that have no path to long-term residency at all. And workers are expected to leave the country when the period ends. What's all the, what about all these so-called undocumented folks living in the US now? That word I've seen in the Q&A and in the chat typically refers to people who do not have either a short-term status or a status that would have a road to citizenship. There are people that either cross the border without being intercepted and have lived under the radar, or they applied for some kind of status, were not successful, and then did not leave. And estimates from the Pew Research Center in January of 25 are still that there are between 10 and 12 million such people living in the country today. The Trump administration, too, has announced its intention to deport them all, focusing first on criminals, which is another term, doesn't necessarily mean what you might think. Of the 10 to 12 million people living here in those statuses, many live in mixed status families, where somebody else in their family may have status, but they don't. And there really is no way for them to normalize their situation. Just no way at all. Who enforces removal orders, deportation orders? That's ICE. Austin talked about that. ICE is the primary agency within the United States responsible for arresting and deporting people. Customs and Border Protection are the folks that at the border protect the border. But you saw the number, 10 to 12 million undocumented people. ICE has in total right now about 20,000 employees. And that includes their law enforcement people, their attorneys, their secretaries, everyone. So 20,000 people cannot intercept, arrest, and deport 10 to 12 million people. It's not feasible, which has resulted in tremendous pressure from the current administration on states, state police, local police, and the military to assist in immigration enforcement. That's what that tension is about. So how did we get to this situation? To add a little context, most people who come to the southern border ask for asylum because they know that word. They think it just means, help me, I'm hurting, let me in. But they don't know what is required to qualify for asylum. And many, if not most, of the people who come to the border do not qualify for asylum. Asylum as a legal status was created after World War II using the same requirements as refugees have to meet in a third country. To qualify, a person has to prove that they fear or were already severely persecuted in their home country, and the persecution was because of their race, religion, national origin, political opinion, or social group. Persecution for any other reason doesn't qualify, and reasons other than persecution, like war, famine, etc., do not qualify. So under the system that's existed for decades, people come to the border, they've asked for asylum, and they're given something called a credible fear interview. In that interview, agents at the border evaluate whether the person's fear of persecution is credible. And if they find it credible, people have been released into the country to pursue their asylum claim in the immigration court system, which is an administrative system run by the Department of Justice. But often people who can prove a credible fear cannot actually prove it in court, and then they cannot prove that their persecution was because of one of those 5 reasons. When people lose their asylum cases in immigration court, they're not then taken into custody like you might see on TV. They just don't leave. So that situation and the impression that more and more and more people are coming to the US over the years and that it's cumulative has become a heavily discussed Republican issue. And then I remind you again of the numbers that there are fewer than 20,000 ICE agents and 10 to 12 million people who are undocumented. That's just a little context. These are my reporting suggestions as a consumer of immigration journalism. Please don't report emotional stories, sad stories about particular individuals and their journeys, without also explaining where those people stand in the process I've just described. Have they gone through a legal process and lost? Is there any relief they can apply for? Tell us, the readers, what's going on and how they got to this difficult position. If you're talking about a person who has a court case or about one of the current plethora of challenges to the Trump administration's many policies, don't report on a legal case without identifying the court, the jurisdiction, the judge's name, and where the case currently stands in the legal system. Many reports right now are talking about injunctions in the various cases against the Trump administration without making it clear whether they are short-term temporary restraining orders, preliminary injunctions that last for the entire duration of the case, etc. Do remind audiences that Congress changes the law in the US. An executive order is not a new law. Only Congress makes the law in this country. That has not changed because of the election. And then I've noticed some other people commenting in the chat. Check out your reporting on legal issues with a practicing lawyer. Most of us who work pro bono or for a nonprofit, and there are some on this call, are willing to chat on or off the record on background, to describe the system, to make sure you get the details right. You can call the lawyer whose name is on the case, or call me and I'll refer you to someone who knows about the specific situation you're asking about. I have some immigration story ideas. We'll make the PowerPoint available. I'm very sorry that we couldn't show it right here. I have some story ideas, one of which is, in your particular community, which industries are dependent on hiring workers who are here without permission? And these are not the people that have short-term visas, but people who have just come into the country. Well, identify them. Farming, construction, food processing, food service, hospitality, housekeeping, construction, gardening. Which industries are dependent on those workers? Another story I would love to read is, what explains the anti-immigrant turn in public sentiment that occurred during the last 2 Biden years? Why did that happen? Is there any relationship to Texas Governor Greg Abbott's practice of busing migrants to other regions of the country? Another issue is, what do pro-immigration folks say about people who lose their cases and still don't leave? Is this a rule of law issue? I mean, is there something to this that we need to pay attention to? In terms of reporting resources, I have a slide about that. Track Reports is obviously great, and please subscribe to Austin's Substack. There's also something called impolicytracking.org that tracks Trump's announced immigration policies. My favorite is called Just Security. It's the Just Security Tracker, which tracks every federal court challenge to Trump policy and links to the complaints. We'll tell you who the lawyer is and how to get them. And I'm happy to take any questions about how the system works. I really thank you for your service. I'm very grateful.
Okay, thank you so much, Linda. That was great. And again, we'll be sharing Linda's slides, although your presentation was perfectly terrific and clear without them. And I'm seeing a ton of questions in the Q&A. We probably won't have time to get to all of them, but I'm going to reach out to all the speakers afterwards and send them the questions, and we will address the ones that we can. I'm also seeing a couple of questions on the chat about, is it okay to quote this webinar? And yeah, I should have said so from the get-go. This is on the record. It would be terrific to see this webinar quoted in any of your stories. And if you reach out to me and let me know that you quoted them, the stories, more is the better. We also, so in addition to the questions in the Q&A box, we did receive a bunch of questions from the people during registration. And I wanted to address some of those. And I'm seeing a lot of these in the Q&A too. Austin, I'll give this one to you, but anyone else, please feel free to weigh in. What can journalists do to verify actual ICE activity, especially when so many rumors are flying around local communities? And a related question, and Austin, you touched on this some, but what sources do you use to confirm ICE arrests and detentions?
Yeah, so both great questions. So in terms of local ICE activity, I've gotten a lot of questions, obviously, in the past month about like data for this or that. The truth is, for the most part, data lags behind enforcement activity. at a length that it probably is not a silver bullet for a very urgent story, typically, unless you have a part of your story that's willing and has the space and the time to put things in context a little bit, which I know not everyone does. So so the detention data, I use that as a proxy for trying to track ICE as closely as possible. But most other things, we're looking at a couple months to a year delay in getting really good data. So in terms of verifying ICE activity, it is challenging. I do think this is where reporters like on the ground really make a difference, and trying to get agencies to comment and noting when they don't comment or verify things. So that's just like a general point, but that's also, you know, it's difficult for all of us, I think, to really meaningfully track in real time what ICE is doing at any given point in time, given the amount of misinformation, the challenges that people have with even identifying which law enforcement agency is in the community. That's always an issue. But in terms of validation, this part's a little easier. There's two strategies that I use for validating any government data set that I roughly define as internal and external. Internal validation basically means, does the data set that the government sent, does it make sense as a coherent data internally, and internally often meaning over time? So for instance, one of the first things I do when I look at ICE detention data is I plug it into a time series data set that I have. And if I see things go down or up in a way that's way out of plausibility, I know that there's an issue. This is actually a very easy way to catch things, especially with ICE's alternatives to detention data. They often have massive over reporting from different ICE offices around the country for some reason, partly due to their contractor. So internal validation is really important. Also, just this is where your knowledge of the immigration system is crucial. Does everything line up in a way that makes sense based on how you know the immigration system works? And to Caitlin's point, this is a really good point where collaborating with an academic or researcher or someone who's deep into the policy is helpful. And external validation, that's the second part. That's basically, can you take any numbers that you have in the data in some data set and match them up with some other external numbers? So for instance, if I get a big data set through FOIA, or even if ICE puts out something, you know, that's a smaller data set, does this make sense in the context of what Congressional Research Service or GAO has published, or what the ICE annual reports say, or what another agency has published that's analogous in some way? Basically, do the numbers make sense in the universe of what we know about data? So even a very simple data set, that's kind of how I do it.
Okay, terrific. And one for Caitlin, this is broad, but I think you'll have some great insights. Do you have advice for doing local or state coverage on the impact of federal policy changes?
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, but there's so many directions to take that. I think you've already heard the advice, basically. So, you know, ICE does arrests in somewhere in your state. Go there, figure out who was picked up, figure out where they worked, figure out where their kids go to school, figure out where they go to church, you know, where they shop for groceries, and talk to people. You know, so people want to know, again, we're looking at these big numbers, you know, what is the impact of immigration in the community? So go to the school system and interview people. I mean, people did a great job of that in Springfield, right? Are they strained? Are the courts strained? You know, are systems overwhelmed, or are they not overwhelmed? But really, really importantly, I want to emphasize, go to the employer and go to the employers that are relying significantly on immigrant labor, like Linda suggested, because that's the sort of point at which we're all implicated in the story, right? Otherwise, it's just a story about these other people over there, and, you know, how do people feel about them? But, you know, they might be farm workers. I live in New York. They might be doing food delivery. They might be doing renovations. They might, you know, be doing roofing and construction. Figure out the ways in which people fit into the fabric of society so that they're not just a number. And of course, that helps with humanizing and empathy, and that's all important in journalism, but it's important for politics. People need to understand what this number means, both the number of people who have moved into maybe this area in recent months or years, as well as the number of arrests. Like, these numbers in isolation mean almost nothing. except that people either get mad at them or have some sort of emotional reaction, but we're not doing our jobs as journalists if we stop there. So I think just follow the numbers. If I hope that's helpful. It was a broad question.
I found it helpful. Yeah, and you can see in the chat that other people did too. Thank you. Linda, one for you, and this is more specific. Can you talk about the legality or constitutionality of ICE detainer requests? And a related question, what local or state policies or laws, if any, limit local law enforcement's cooperation with ICE? And in addressing that, can you explain what an ICE detainer request is? Because I'm not sure everybody knows.
Sure. An ICE detainer request, what's being referred to there is a request from ICE to hold somebody who is in the custody of a state or city criminal system beyond their term of being held or incarcerated so that ICE agents can come pick them up. That's a detainer request. Please hold this person so we can go pick them up and put them in our system or deport them. That question is what's at the root of the lawsuits over so-called sanctuary cities, where some cities like Los Angeles, where I presently am, have enacted policies that prohibit their police forces from offering that kind of professional courtesy to ICE. The Trump administration is furious about this, and I think the root of it is that ICE doesn't have enough agents, and they want to sort of make the state and local police forces into their sub-agents to make their lives a bit easier. The question ultimately goes to separation of powers in the Constitution and how unenumerated powers are reserved to the states under the Constitution. That means that if the Constitution doesn't say the states have to do something, it's the state's discretion. These issues, though, are right now being litigated because the Trump administration, in reaction to the so-called sanctuary city policies and the announcements of our police forces will not do this courtesy for you anymore, ICE. There are federal, the Trump administration has announced retaliatory policies toward those jurisdictions. You can find details of the lawsuits in the Just Security website that I mentioned. And if you just Google Just Security, you'll find it. Every single lawsuit that is pending is on there. And the main one right now is the Amica Center for Immigrant Rights versus the Department of Justice. There's also one, there are several on the issue of who's the boss, the feds or the states, on the issue of police cooperation. I don't know if that answered the question, but that was probably a mouthful.
I think so. I think we have time for one more. And I'll take one from the Q&A box. And I think anybody can address this. How do you see immigration policy evolving in 2025? And what underreported issues or trends should journalists be paying attention to this year?
I think that we've touched on a lot of trends that we're looking out for. And in terms of policy, the administration has articulated a pretty clear agenda and set of goals. And so there are ways in which this is a more straightforward reporting environment for you to work in, because you don't have to guess. They're sort of headed in one direction. And there will be new ideas that pop up to achieve the same end. But I think what we're all asking for is for people to go deeper in their stories beyond just numbers. And when you work with numbers, to contextualize them and avoid sensationalizing in this moment. I saw a related question from Martin Costi. Hi, Martin Costi. I've been enjoying your work a lot. And you were asking about this other figure that is now commonly cited about, you know, the U.S. having the highest percentage of foreign-born residents ever. You know, if you look at the graph, you know, from the New York Times story that everybody started everybody talking about that figure, you can see that it's a really, really long wave. So yes, we have ticked just above the previous record of 14.8. So you can say this moment is record breaking, and I think that certainly people are feeling demographic change, and it is part of what's driving politics. But I think a lot of what's driven politics to the point that we are now is hair on fire coverage of monthly border crossings. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been on TV and I'm just asked, how many people crossed the border last month? And it doesn't matter if the answer is 20,000 or 100,000. If I just say that and I don't put it into context, then people have no idea what to take away from it. You know, the other way of looking back historically at the moment prior to this one, when we had a similar percentage of immigrants living in the United States, that was the 1920s, right? That was the moment right before Chinese exclusion, followed shortly after by national origins quotas, which was basically a race-based immigration system that we had until the 1960s, when the system opened up really dramatically. And so that's another way of contextualizing this moment in history. And why aren't people talking about that? Or, you know, I think at the very least, journalists should be thinking about the role that we play in a moment like this. So we do know from social science that when you have significant demographic change, it's destabilizing. It makes people fearful, and it influences public opinion. But journalism plays a really big role in that. So we are in a moment with really high immigration, and I think that there's a way to validate that and to acknowledge it, but without playing into some of the worst impulses that have helped lead to these policies that we're now as a country, you know, deeply ashamed of, you know, 100 years ago. And I'm not saying that we're headed there now, but what I'm saying is that I think it's right to acknowledge when we break records, and it's important to keep our feet on the ground and to provide context around numbers, and putting all this together, I think, is going to lead to the best coverage.
Okay, great. We are at time, but does anyone else want to address questions?
Sure. We still got people in the room, so I'll answer, but obviously we want to wrap. But I think there's two things I'll say, and I appreciate Caitlin's comments a lot too. One is one of the biggest stories, one of the most important changes of the Biden administration was the massive expansion of electronic monitoring of migrants in the country, which affected, well over 1 million, maybe 1.5 million migrants went through electronic monitoring. The Republicans criticize this program as some sort of like easy way out, but in fact, the Trump administration is starting off with more granular data on more migrants in this country than any administration ever has. And they don't have the detention capacity to detain everyone. And they have a massive amount of information to go after people. That I haven't seen a single story about what the Trump administration is doing with electronic monitoring. It's a little tough because they sort of would have to pivot on it politically, on the politics of electronic monitoring. But I mean, it's a subtle but huge thing. So little context there. The second thing I would just say is, we keep coming back to context. I think it's really hard to be a reporter and to not actually know what's new, because everything feels new. But even the reporting around Guantanamo Bay is, detention center. It's also like, I mean, the Biden administration is the one that extended that contract and started most of the new, you know what I mean? So I just think I would encourage everyone, when you're writing about something that's new, I think the nature of the Trump administration is to make everything feel like it's new. And a lot of it's actually not new. So just being mindful of being able to try to parse what's new and what isn't, not because it's just a trivia question, but because it changes how we think about what the source of the problem is. I actually think that Jonathan Blitzer has a really good point in his book about, like, we keep associating every immigration thing with the name of the administration. It's the Biden this, it's the Trump that, it's the Obama that. Actually, that's not usually or not always the primary association for different, policies and moments in immigration.
Okay, thank you. Linda, anything else to add before we wrap up?
Feel free to use us as resources, and we'll point you to the right resources if we don't know the answer.
Yes, and we'll be sharing information about how to reach these people and other great researchers and journalists on the Journalist Resource website, which is journalistresource.org. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I know how busy journalists and everyone is and are right now, so it means a lot to me to see so many great conversations and such an engaged audience. And we will probably do another one of these soon. So there's obviously a need for it. So hope you all have a great day, and thank you everybody for attending. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.